Hey folks, I'm Matt Easton and I really like swords. Now I get sent a lot of messages and unfortunately I was sent a quite interesting message I think about a week ago relative to when I'm filming this video of course, and that had a question in it. Now unfortunately I cannot for the life of me find this message, so many apologies if you asked me this question and I've subsequently lost your message. I meant to make a note of your name. I think your name might have been David, but I can't remember. Many apologies. Feel free to comment underneath and say, that's me, okay? And I will like it and say this is the person. But thank you for that question anyway. And also, just while I'm talking, as I'm always talking on this channel of course, but I just want to say once again, apologies, I can't answer all the questions and queries that I get. I have like 4 jobs and I can't sit there answering questions all day, and I'm really sorry for that because I do really appreciate it, and as this video illustrates, sometimes I get a really good question and I respond to it. So the question was, if I remember correctly, the question was, how do you assess whether a sword is good if you don't know anything about it? So I think, and I might be wrong, I might be making an assumption that's incorrect here, but I think that this question comes about from the basis of if you were in a survival situation and you found a sword, how would you assess whether you could trust your life to that sword? Or perhaps it's a role-playing game type thing and you've escaped a prison and there's a guard asleep and there's a sword and you take the sword, and you know there's all sorts of scenarios we could make up to say why you might need to do this, and actually, you know, we can laugh about this and we can think about it in role-playing or LARPing, whatever kind of computer gaming terms. But actually, this is the sort of thing that must have happened historically, okay? It must have absolutely happened that people must have grabbed a sword or taken a sword or even bought a sword, and a person wanted to assess whether that sword was good. Right, so I'm going to show the things that I would do. Initially, I'm going to show a bit in here and then I'm going to step outside into my garden and show you some other things. I'm looking at the garden there. Show you some other things that I would do to assess how good that sword might be. So first up, I'm just going to take this sword. So this is a cutlass, 1845 cutlass, that has recently entered my collection. That does mean that I'm going to probably have to filter one of the other cutlasses out of my collection, one in, one out, door policy, simply because I can't have all the cutlasses. But this is a very nice condition. It is a bit grubby at the moment. It's made by Hilt, and it's got a Birmingham proof mark on it. Probably dates to the late 1840s, around 1850. And I know some things, so it's relatively a relatively known quantity to me in that I know the model of sword. I know it's an 1845 pattern Royal Navy cutlass, and I know it's made by Hilt, and Hilt was a fairly decent maker, and I can see that it's got a Birmingham proof stamp on it. So I already know quite a lot of information about this particular item, but I just thought it's something that I haven't cleaned up yet and I don't mind demonstrating some things with because I trust it to be fairly strong. But let's assume, for the purposes of this video, that I don't yet know anything. So there's no markings on this, and it's a slightly unfamiliar model of sword to me. So the very first thing I'm going to do when I pick it up, okay, is, it's funny because I do a lot of these things now. I've been collecting swords since I was about 16, 17 years old. I'm now 41. God, I'm so old. So a lot of years, and there are a lot of things I do kind of instinctively, subconsciously, without necessarily realizing I'm doing them. So when I picked up this sword, just before I switched the camera on, there were a few things I did when my brain thought what the topic of this video was. Now, one of the things was I grabbed the hilt and I did this, okay? So this would apply to medieval swords or swords with complex hilts or, forms of basket guard or whatever. First thing is to find out, is the hilt secure on the tang? That's the first thing. Is there any movement? Is there any movement in the grip or any movement in the guard? And those are 2 separate things. So to find if there's movement in the guard, you hold the base of the blade, assuming that it's either not sharp down there or you hold it so the sharp edges are not cutting into you. There's no movement at all there. Let's check the grip, because you can have movement in one and not in the other. No movement whatsoever. Then you look at how it's attached to the tang, and I can see that it's peened very securely at the end. So this is absolutely rock solid. And incidentally, if you hold the sword relatively lightly, dong, and do that. Some swords, I have to say this is exaggerated because it's a cutlass with an iron grip and an iron guard and a steel blade, and so it's all quite one solid piece. But any sword, even a medieval sword, let's just grab a medieval sword to demonstrate this off the wall. Let's grab the so-called Henry V reproduction. If I grab that and hold it relatively lightly by the wooden grip, different ring. It's quite pleasing. This is, I could do a whole channel now of different, what does this sword sound like? Nice ring. So that tells us that it's relatively solid. Some people, I noticed someone on one of the Facebook groups, could have been All Swords or one of the others, asking why do some swords make a ring and some make a dull clack? And quite simply, it's to do, in my view, it's to do with hilt construction and how secure that hilt construction is. If it's very tight and very solid on the tang, you will, generally speaking, get a ring. If there isn't a ring, it tells you something's loose, okay? And as John Musgrave Waite says, if something's loose in your hilt, tighten it or get it tightened. Right, so that's the first thing. The hilt is completely, ow, that's quite solid. The hilt is completely tight on the tang. Next thing, blade. And obviously this is actually, in a sense, the most important thing. Although you want to know that the hilt is secure on the blade, because you could have the best blade in the world, and if the hilt's rubbish, the blade might go flying out of the hilt, or it might be moving around in the hilt and you can't hit with proper edge alignment. Remember, if there's any movement between the grip and the blade, it might be quite difficult to align your edge in the cut, so you won't cut effectively when you do hit. But in terms of the blade, there's a few things we're going to do. Now, the first thing I'm going to do inside, and then I'm going to step outside and carry on talking about the blade out there. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to do a very gentle flex test. Now, surprisingly, that doesn't tell you as much as you might think that it's supposed to tell you. And there's a reason for that I'll explain. So, not all swords are spring-tempered. So for any of you who watch Forged in Fire, you'll notice that sometimes they edge quench. Now, swords were sometimes edge quenched. Famously, a lot of Japanese swords and some Indian swords were essentially just edge quenched. So they had a relatively soft back, but a relatively hard edge. Now, what this means is if you have a soft back and a hard edge, you are unlikely to have a spring or very much spring temper. European blades, at least of this date, are pretty much always done like a spring, like most modern production swords. Okay, so this type of sword is a spring. That tells me a couple of things instantly. First of all, if it springs just a little bit and goes back to true, I know that it's been hardened and tempered. Okay, so I don't know that it's been tempered, but I know it's probably been tempered. If it's just been hardened, it will probably be very stiff, and at some point it will go snap. Okay, but if it's been hardened and tempered, and incidentally on Forged in Fire, they don't show the tempering. And I have no idea why. They always show the quench, and so a lot of people now think that they know about knife making and think that all knives are just quenched. Well, they have to be tempered as well, otherwise you end up with an incredibly brittle blade, and even more so with a sword because it's longer. So we know that this is spring tempered essentially, which means it's like a spring, like a leaf spring. It's a sharpened leaf spring. So that's the next thing. Now, there are a couple of other things I'm going to do, and I'm going to step outside to talk about those. So the next bit is kind of simplistic and kind of funny, but you want to hit something. You want to hit something that's relatively forgiving. In this case, I've got my trusty old punch bag there. Now, there are a few ways you want to hit it, and this is based on the Wilkinson test. In other words, the test that Wilkinson Sword Company, now who make razors and things like that, used to do. And clearly we're going to hit on the edge, we're going to hit on the back, and we're going to hit on the flats as well. You don't need to do it very violently, okay, just enough to give you an idea about how solid that hilt is and also how the blade reacts to that. Okay, so first of all, give it a couple of good whacks with the edge. Yeah, it's all good. Back edge, bit difficult with this kind of hilt, but you can still do it. Good. Yeah, everything's all solid and tight. Flat, not so hard because that's more aggressive to the blade and it's more likely to damage it, hitting with the flat, because it's not designed to do that. Good, it's all true, nothing nasty happened, good. There's one other final thing, and this was sometimes done, it was sometimes done on iron plates, believe it or not, to test the hardness of the steel. Now, we're not doing that here, that would be quite destructive, especially as this is an antique, but simply something that's fairly resistive. We could do this against the wood, lightly, or we could do it against the punch bag. Against the punch bag, we're going to get a penetration, as you see there. You see how easily that goes in. Remember the spadroon and small sword test I did? You'll notice, because this is a wider, stiffer, heavier blade, it goes that far in with very little effort at all, okay? But we could equally do that on the wood, okay? And we've got no damage. You can see it's a fairly light test. It's not doing any damage to it whatsoever. I'm doing it in a very controlled way, but it's giving me information. Now there are finally a few other things we can test which might be more destructive, but we're going to talk about those back inside. Yeah, so here we are back inside, and there are some more destructive things you can do to a sword to ascertain its quality. Now, there's essentially two things, apart from, we've already talked enough about the hilt and how secure the hilt is. You can bash it around, you can wrench it, you can do all sorts of, you can just basically repeatedly hit something and see if it loosens up, things like that. There's various relatively simplistic things we can do to ascertain the strength of the hilt, but just focusing on the blade and the blade quality. So there are essentially two qualities that most sword blades have from them. And I also want to mention about the fact that some things were only edge quenched. Now, if something's only edge quenched, and I'm just going to pull one off the wall that probably is only edge quenched, and that is this Indian tulwar. Now, if I were to flex this, indeed this does flex a bit, but I wouldn't want to flex this too much, because from past experience and getting antiques that were bent and straightening them myself, I know that many Indian swords are relatively soft at the back but are clearly edge quenched. And in fact, this Wootz sword behind me here, any of you who've watched my etching of Wootz steel blade will know that there's a hardening line visible on that blade. So I'm fairly certain that this is only edge quenched as well. That being the case, if I flex one of those blades, at some point it will stay bent. I mean, theoretically, any blade will stay bent if you bend it far enough, but the ones that are only edge quenched will stay bent with less flex. Okay, so the flex test is only to be done up to a certain point. One thing I'll mention is small swords in the 18th century. There are treatises that talk about testing small swords by thrusting them into a wall. Now clearly this is going to slightly blunt the point, although remember that walls at that point might be wattle and daub, they might not be brick, you know, but nevertheless thrusting into a wall, even if it's plaster or whatever, don't worry about the fact that the tip gets a bit damaged, that can be resharpened, but what you're testing is the temper of the blade. Does it flex and come back to true? But coming back to this sword, so the more brutal things I can do to ascertain the quality of this blade, they come down to two particular categories of thing. One is toughness and the other is hardness. Now very clearly you can make a piece of steel very, very hard but not tough. What do I mean by that? Well, you can quench it but not temper it. You can give it a very brutal hardening quench, so you make the edge very, very high, let's say like 65 Rockwell, okay, which would be very, very hard for a steel sword edge. It might be 65 Rockwell, but if you drop that sword it will shatter like glass, okay, whereas if I've quenched that sword and then I temper it and it comes back down to say 55 Rockwell, it now might have a pretty hard edge. That is, by sword standard, 55 Rockwell is pretty damn hard, just about as hard as most functional swords get. Japanese swords sometimes get a bit harder than that. But it will have toughness, that is, it will be able to absorb shock without breaking like glass. So, and it's all to do with the way that the structure lines up in the steel, the crystalline structure. But, so what I want is a tough blade that's reasonably hard. And we have to remember as well that whilst it might be ideal to have an edge that's hard and a blade that's tough, if you can't, for some reason, if you're having to make in a primitive environment survival situation something that is sharp but not hard, it will still cut flesh, it will still cut bone, it will take damage doing that, but it will still function as a weapon. And something in the, to mention Forged in Fire again, that sometimes annoys me, is they talk about something which hasn't taken a quench well not being a proper weapon or not being a functional weapon. Hello? What about the Bronze Age? What about the Iron Age? Like, it's just rubbish, okay? You can have something that's made of a softer metal, copper, bronze, iron, you know, any metal that's softer than steel, that you don't necessarily quench or harden, it's still a functional weapon. It's still a sharp bit of metal, okay? Anyway, enough of that rant. So the final way that I could test this, if I want it to be as good as it possibly can be, is doing a more brutal flex test. And indeed, that is what the Wilkinson Sword Company used to do. They used to mount the sword in the éprouvette machine and flex it to a certain number of degrees and back again and check that the blade was still straight, and then flex it to a certain number of degrees to the other side and check that the blade was straight. If it was proved, stamped. If it wasn't, if it was bent, it would be thrown away. Okay, so they only took the best ones. The other way you can test is for, the other thing you can test is for hardness. Now the way that they do it, again, in Forged in Fire is usually, and this many blacksmiths will do this, once something's been quenched, you just get a file and put the file over the edge, and if it skates over the surface and doesn't really bite in, then it shows it's hard. If the quench hasn't taken because maybe you didn't get it up to a high enough temperature before quenching it, for example, or it's not enough carbon in the blade, so it's just not good enough steel for quenching, then when you put the file across, you'll feel the file biting in and filing away the surface. Okay, so you can test it with a file, but what if it's a survival situation, zombie apocalypse, role-playing game, you've taken a sword off a guard? How can you test the hardness of that blade? Well, there are several ways. One, you can literally just grate it against something and see how much damage it does. A hardened steel blade, if you're familiar with hardened steel, a hardened steel blade against brick, for example, will take very little damage and will carve a bit off the brick, whereas a soft, like mild steel blade will take damage against brick. You will know that. You will have that frame of reference. But if, for example, you have a knife of known hardness, and this is something I don't necessarily condone, but say for example you have a knife that you already have in your possession and the sword has just come into your possession, and now you know that this blade is relatively hard, you know that what it is compared relatively to other things, that is. So what you can do is you can literally go bink with the two edges into each other and see which one takes more damage, and that will give you a frame of reference. So if this one puts a big notch in this and takes no damage, you know that this is a hard blade and this is a soft blade. If they do equal damage or similar damage, you know they're probably roughly equal hardness. So there we go, folks. I hope that's kind of interesting. It might be useful for role-playing games or whatever kind of scenarios you're thinking about. You can tell an awful lot about a sword's quality purely from some very, very simple things you can do, and non-destructive as well. And nothing I have shown in this video done to this sword has done any damage to it whatsoever. It still rings like a bell. It's still a lovely, beautiful thing in very nice condition. It's grubby, needs cleaning up, but it's a lovely, lovely piece, lovely cutlass. One final thing I would say is, if you're if you're genuinely in the real world testing a training weapon, for example, like a feather or a fencing foil or whatever, do not test it too often, because metal fatigue, okay? So aeroplane wings eventually get decommissioned because they get fractures in them. It's exactly the same thing with sword blades. If I get this and flex, 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 if I just do this for like 20 years, eventually it will snap, okay? If I flex it slightly too far, slightly too far, slightly too far, at some point it will go ping and snap, okay? Metal fatigues. That's why when you get a thin piece of metal and go bend, 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 it breaks. So it work hardens in a localized area, fatigues, snaps, and that will happen with training weapons. So you don't want to regularly be flexing your épées, foils, feathers, whatever. You don't want to be essentially testing them on a regular basis, because that's also fatiguing them. But conversely, it's kind of a paradox here, paradoxical point. If it's a training weapon, you want to know it's safe. So equally, you do want to test a training weapon before you then go and practice with another human being with it, where it might break and gash them or stick in them. So you do want to check that it does flex safely and return to true, and that you can hit it on a forgiving soft object like my punch bag and it's not going to shatter into pieces. Okay, I hope that's given you some food for thought, and I'll see you for the next video. Cheers, folks.